The following podcast is sponsored by Basico. At Basico, we understand your needs and pain points. Our expertise in CFO services, legal, finance IT, and people and payroll helps drive your business forward by inspiring change and challenging norms. We believe in deep explorative discussions and critical angles, the same spirit that fuels the Only Constant podcast hosted by our own Lasse Rindom. Discover more about Basico's vision and services at basico.dk. And if you like what you hear in this episode, please don't hesitate to share it with a friend. And now Lasse, take it away.
You are listening to The Only Constant, a podcast where we go beyond the usual discussions in technology and business and aim to explore more than explain. Join me for engaging discussions with a diverse range of global thought leaders as we seek to uncover new perspectives and insights in a free-flowing conversation. My guest today is Phil Lee, and I am your host, Lasse Rindom. Hi Phil, and welcome to The Only Constant. I'm super happy that you're here with me today, and I'm glad we're finally getting to do this episode, so welcome.
Thanks for having me.
So ever since I met you the first time, 2 years ago at the Openly conference, I've been thinking about we should speak on the podcast. And when I met you again last year, also at the Openly conference in Copenhagen, I thought, okay, now I need to get Phil on the show, because Phil is one of Europe's finest experts on GDPR, the AI Act, and the Data Act now as well. I need to get that perspective also on the podcast. So I'm just super happy that you are taking the time to discuss with me today.
No, thank you. I'm genuinely excited to be here. And actually, having seen some of the people that you've had on the show before, I feel that I'm in quite elevated company.
Well, I think you're going to elevate it even further. So thank you for that, Phil. Phil, and also I need to be, very aware. How do I do this? Talking to a Brit, you have to be always very, humble, right? The gentleman is humble, right? I have to not brag too much about you and all that. Isn't that the way you do it?
Yeah, it is very much a cultural thing, I think. It's funny because I've worked on both sides of the Atlantic. Obviously most of my life has been spent in the UK, and to me, that sort of way of not trying to brag or anything like that is just part of your daily life. It's the way that we live. And then I spent a few years working in America, and it was such a different experience because, the folks over there are very proud of their achievements, and rightly so. And it's a great thing to see that level of optimism and enthusiasm, but they talk so openly about it in a way that feels quite unnatural to a Brit. You try to sort of, I suppose, hide anything you've achieved or done in your lives for fear of people calling you out and just saying that you're bragging. So yes, it is a cultural thing.
Yeah, but I think also, you just said it. They're so proud of everything they've done over there, and rightly so. And that's also a British way to say, and it's very, very, you've definitely deserved it. But me, I have deserved absolutely nothing from life, right? That's
one of my funniest experiences actually was when I first worked in America. I had this American admin who started working for me, and we had an office party one day, and my wife attended, and she took my wife aside, and she said, I've just got to ask some questions. Like, what is it? What does Phil mean when he says something is fine? And my wife said, well, it really depends on, how did he say it? Did he say it? It's fine. In which case he's happy. That's a good thing. Or was he like, fine? In which case he's very disappointed. and my admin said to my wife, she said, well, what does he say when he's really pleased? And she said, he'll say, that's not bad. And yeah, that's the British way of interacting.
I love that. It's just super impossible to. But it also reminds me that my favorite thing is when everyone, especially Americans, but also British people, ask you, how are you? Hi Lasse, hi, how are you? And you do that to Scandinavian, and they'll be like explaining to you how they feel about their mother, what happened at home this morning, how they argue with their wife and all that. You'll get everything, if you ask, how are you? Because if I ask someone in Denmark, how are you? It's because I care. I really want to know how are you? But really, you don't want to. It's just being polite, how are you? And let's move on to something else.
No, and with the Brits, we'll pivot to the weather as quickly as we can.
Yeah, and there's nothing to talk about. There's always raining. Anyway, Phil, everyone right now, is like very focused, and there's a lot of marketing also going around on this, and a lot of messaging around this about the AI Act, obviously. But is this really the most consequential piece of legislation for AI projects?
I mean, it's a really interesting question, and it obviously is a very consequential piece of legislation. But I think, with all the sort of headlines that you hear about it, people tend to forget there are a lot of other laws that are out there that are also going to regulate all of the AI projects and tools and features and functions that we all either develop or use in our day-to-day lives. So, the AI Act is a very specific piece of legislation. It's looking to achieve specific things with certain categories of AI. So those that are, either going to be banned because they're seen to present sort of risks that are just unacceptable, or that are particularly high risk, or that are generative, and and we need to make people aware of when they're dealing with synthetic content versus real content. So it has a very specific catalogue, if you like, of AI that it's looking to regulate. But beyond that, we also obviously have laws like the GDPR that regulates any kind of collection and use of personal data, and many of the AI systems that we interacting with will obviously have consumed vast amounts of personal data, in their training and their development. So there's things like the GDPR, obviously a lot of cybersecurity legislation that is coming through in the EU as well, in terms of kind of making sure that products and servers and systems are secure and resilient against attacks. And then you even get some of the sort of sector specific stuff like you look at the Digital Operational Resilience Act. It's a piece of legislation that is oriented towards financial services entities, but also has specific rules about the kinds of IT providers that they engage, and specific requirements that it flows down to them. Again, predominantly with a cybersecurity element to it. But all of these laws are going to regulate all of the AI systems that we have. So the AI Act is important, but it's also quite key not to think about it in isolation.
But this seems like almost the AI Act is like a tip of the iceberg, right? And I also makes me think, is there something to it that Europe is over regulating, or is this even particular to Europe?
Yeah, well, I mean, that is the common complaint that I think people throw at Europe. Is the over-regulation thing, that we have a lot of laws, and if I'm being completely honest, I do think there's an awful lot of complexity in the laws that we have. There's a lot of overlap. There's a lot of ways that they interact together. And if I look back on how my career has sort of developed over the past 20 years or so, I originally kind of began primarily as a data protection lawyer, and it was quite a nice life to live because all I needed to really worry about was data protection law. And even back then, data protection law was a relatively niche field. Not many people thought it was going to become much. I mean, I actually had one of the partners at the very first law firms I worked at told me that I needed to diversify, and that data protection was just a fad and it would pass. And and obviously I'm kind of glad he was proven wrong, because I would have had a very short career were that not the case. But it was more straightforward, and there weren't many countries that had privacy laws. And then we sort of almost viral effect of countries adopting EU-style laws around the world to regulate privacy and data protection. And obviously the US is the big market that still does the things slightly differently, but a lot of the other countries around the world have adopted laws that are very similar to data protection. So for those of us that were operating in the UK, we then had to worry about UK law, then sort of broader EU law, and then broader global privacy law. So that geographically, the whole space became very complicated. Then you throw into that, other laws that we've had over time, as the sort of EU has expanded its digital and data regulatory rule book, the Digital Services Act, the Digital Markets Act, all the cyber laws that I've been talking about, the Data Act, and now the AI Act. And it's very difficult, I think, to be a practitioner in just one of these areas. You typically need to know a lot of them. But, I can't pretend for a second that I know all of them, or all of them in great detail. And so, there is this kind of, there are these proposals now that we need to look at this, and we need to make things a little bit simpler, because the concern is that while the very biggest operators may have all the resources and the armies of lawyers and compliance professionals and risk managers they need to oversee compliance with these laws, The smaller, the mid-sized enterprises that are coming up, that are innovating, that are developing new products and services, it's just too complicated for them. And so we are looking at that. And obviously there are proposals at an EU level now to try and simplify down some of those rules.
But isn't it, that makes me think that, laws and regulation are supposed to be like a trajectory, so it makes it easier to operate. That everyone's operating on the same rules and it's not your own responsibility. I think Kate O'Neill on the podcast said that, a deregulated market doesn't mean you don't have responsibility. It just means it doesn't mean there's no regulation or responsibility. It just means it's all on you, she said, right? And so are we failing that way if we are not making this a trajectory that's easy to follow? If it's becoming too complex, then someone might just say, let me just have the responsibility on my own instead.
So again, it's interesting, and I think you get to see different philosophies around this. If you look at a market like the US, typically the approach there is very much one of kind of innovate and try things, and then we'll regulate when we see things go wrong, and we'll try and prevent it happening again. I think the European approach is much more one of, let's try and foresee things that could go wrong, and let's regulate to prevent those harms from arising in the first place. Sometimes people characterize it as the American approach as being everything is permitted until it's not, and the European approach as being everything's forbidden until it's allowed. And that's a bit of a gross characterization. I'm not sure it's quite like that, but fundamentally, I think law as a tool is supposed to do a few things. It's supposed to drive the kind of behaviors we want and the values we want as a society. It's also, to your point, I suppose, intended to provide certainty for businesses. You know that if you provide tools in this particular way, you won't be subject to some kind of regulatory hazard risk where you'll get fines or lawsuits, out of the blue that could be, in some cases, business ending. And but one of the things I've talked about in the past is that I think there is a danger where law gets too complicated, that you enter a kind of regulatory vicious circle where, the laws get very complicated, so companies become out of compliance with them, not necessarily because they're trying to be out of compliance, just because there's too many rules for them to follow. And then because they do that, the perception becomes that they're evil companies because they've not followed the law. And so the solution to that, if you're a legislator or a regulator, is to say, well, we need to create more rules to prevent that happening. So you create more, the space becomes more crowded with rules and laws. And then that means companies only become further out of compliance. And so the whole thing goes round and round. And I'm not in any way, shape or form arguing for a complete deregulation or anything like that. But I do think there is a value to making rules achievable and to, looking at where things have become overcomplicated and asking yourself the question, can we simplify these things down? What are the rules that are actually driving value? What are the things that are really driving the behaviors that we want? What are the things we really want not to happen? How do we create the simplest rule book that we can in order to achieve that?
I think on that point, I think Eva Sorowska said on the podcast in December that she wishes there were more regulation because she said she talked to a lot of banks and insurance companies who's just not doing anything right now because they're sure there will be regulation on some of the specifics they want to do, but as long as they feel there's not enough regulation, they will not be doing anything. So that's one extreme, right? And then there's the other extreme where some companies, smaller companies probably, as you also mentioned, will be saying that we won't be doing anything, or we'll be doing things we won't be telling anyone because we're like, the Protestant, you're always a sinner, right? There will always be some sin you could find with me. So on those two extremes, is there a middle road that's golden, or is this just, an inhibition for everyone across the whole spectrum?
I think one of the challenges that technology presents in particular is that, in the past, in order to create tools that were societally impactful, you had to be an organization of a particular size. You had to be quite large. You had to have the manpower, the resources, the infrastructure and everything to do all of that kind of stuff. I think with the advent of computer technology and cloud services and all those kinds of things, now you can be, for maybe oversimplifying slightly, but two guys in a garage in Silicon Valley with a hosted cloud service, and you can collect all the data there is in the world about people. And so the concept of how you decide to create a tiered rule book for maybe smaller organizations versus larger organizations becomes more challenging, because the risks that two guys, a garage and a cloud service can can attract, can be in some ways just as significant as larger organizations. So I don't know that I necessarily have the answer to that, but I do think, I do think it's a question of constantly sort of taking out the rules and saying, where are these things working? Where are they not working? Where are things falling through the cracks? And how do we address those things? There are some things I look at in sort of, in some of the rules we work on where I think, these seem to have little more than kind of pure administrative or bureaucratic value. They're not really solving a problem. And and for me, I like to look at where laws are actually going to have practical consequences and where they're actually going to really drive behavioral change. I see that in sort of corporate policies as well. A very simple example I often see was, for a long time, it was very common in a lot of IT policies, internal IT policies, to say to people, you must not use our IT infrastructure for personal use. You mustn't check your Gmail, you mustn't book holidays. And to me, that's just nonsense, because that's what everybody uses corporate IT for. So sort of saying that kind of thing, all you do is immediately create a rule that nobody's going to comply with and you can't possibly enforce. But actually creating rules where you sort of say, okay, we're going to allow these things to happen because we recognize that's just a reality of life. But at the same time, we're going to create some rules around enabling that to happen safely and making sure that, you do it in the ways that we can tolerate within our sort of risk limits. That to me seems like a much more sensible approach. And I think that kind of mentality sometimes needs to be brought forward towards lawmaking as well.
So more transparency instead of just more, forbidding, basically.
I mean, I would describe it perhaps more as steering. So I'm not just transparency, because you can, that's a very American approach, is to kind of disclose everything and then say, hey, it's on you if this goes wrong. But to sort of, create the boundaries of what is acceptable and not acceptable behavior, but, not try to sort of just say no to everything because it's new or because it's a new technology. And, I think we do have to recognize that, technology changes. By the way, when, one of the things I was very conscious of with this podcast, the only constant, was not to say change is the only constant, because that's just such a cliche. But, technology does constantly evolve. And I think the natural human tendency with that stuff is to kind of not like stuff changing, particularly when you reach a certain age. You want things to stay the way they are. Was it Douglas Adams who said, every technology before the age of 40 is new and exciting, and everything after the age of 40 is, unnatural and ought to be forbidden. And I try not to slip into that mindset. But I think, but I think there is that human reaction where you don't like things to change from under you. But, technology will change. And I think we have to kind of get away from the mindset of just saying we're just going to ban it because it is new, or we're going to try and prohibit it. But we also have to look at sort of saying, we recognize the benefits these things can bring, but, we need to be transparent. We recognize there are some values that we think are so important to us, preventing, physical harm, or preventing
manipulation.
Yeah, all that kind of stuff, and then create the rules around that. And to be fair, that is, I think, what the EU AI Act does do.
But weren't like something like manipulation already forbidden before as well?
Sorry,
manipulation, wasn't that already sort of forbidden already, or was that okay before the AI Act, or?
It's a good question. I don't, off the top of my head, I don't know. I'm trying to think, is there a law that immediately, forbids manipulation? I mean, I'm sure under sort of individual country laws, there are probably rules against misrepresenting things or, committing fraud or all those kinds of things. But, manipulation, vulnerable groups. I suppose what the AI Act is trying to do is say, okay, you may, on a per country basis, have your own individual attitudes towards these things, but we're going to create this one rule we want to apply uniformly across all countries.
There was a political party in Denmark some years back who went on a big countrywide campaign saying, criminalize criminal gangs. I'm like, yeah. They use different words for it, but forbade criminal gangs. Like, of course, it's already illegal, right? So let's.
Yeah, and it's a very good point. I mean, of course, you can say with something like AI, as we said at the outset, there are lots of laws that regulate AI already. So I guess what we're asking ourselves is there something new about AI that needs regulating on top of those laws that already exist? And and maybe there is, but I think
But also asking, Phil, are we trying to regulate malevolent actors, right? Or people who wants to do evil, do bad, right? And will they be stopped by a new act from the EU?
Well, I suppose what you're asking is that kind of that equivalent of When you fly into the US, you used to get that little sort of landing form that sort of say to you, are you a terrorist? And you kind of think, well, if I was, I probably wouldn't take the form. What extra benefit does it give you?
But there was also this lobbying registers where you could for environment and all that, where you could say, we are registering and we're saying everything we're doing. But funnily enough, all the big chem producers and all those who were polluting like crap, they were not registering because they knew there would just be there would just be, it was a voluntary thing, and they would just be in the red all the time. So they would always, they're the bad guys anyway. The bad guys don't care.
Well, yeah, and I think that is a real concern, because whenever you create a law, the good guys will comply, the bad guys won't comply. So you can't just have the law on its own. It has to actually be backed by meaningful enforcement. Yeah. And that's somewhere where there's been a lot of criticism that, for example, there hasn't been enough enforcement of the GDPR, and we'd have to, see how this evolves under the AI Act. But unfortunately, if you just have paper without enforcement, it is just that, it is paper. And, and as companies, organizations become comfortable that there's no real teeth to the rules that are created, then of course the incentive not to follow those rules becomes that much greater.
But you also had something like, with GDPR, that first of all, not enough enforcement. Then suddenly in Denmark, they came out and enforced Google Analytics is forbidden, right? Or something like that. And then you're like, all the companies in the whole world are using this. And every company, every SMB in Denmark will keep on using it because they need it. It's part of, they invest so much money in it. How can you just forbid it? So there's this weird, we'll do something crazy here and then we'll not do anything about all this. But, I feel this, I always felt about GDPR and... I think I still do, that it becomes very much, like the Monty Python sketch of the Spanish Inquisition, right? No one expects the Spanish Inquisition. Ta-da! And they just show up and then they'll find something on you, right? No matter what.
Yeah, it's such a good point. And it's a conversation I have with clients quite often, actually, is that, they will often say to me, what is the risk of doing X or not doing X? And I have to say something that, data protection risk is really hard to judge, to be quite honest with you, because, it's... If you think about, for example, something like the Privacy Shield or the Safe Harbor before that, which was this transatlantic framework for transferring data from Europe to the US, whoever would have imagined that something that significant between two economically hugely important regions, negotiated by governmental entities, would be brought down by an Austrian law student who had a beef against one company. It was a kind of crazy thing to think, but actually it shows how a single complaint from a single individual can end up becoming massively impactful and having these huge consequences. So, I can say to clients sometimes that, look, the likelihood of anyone kind of raising an issue around this, or the likelihood of someone bringing it as a complaint, is probably quite low in a lot of cases. But the potential consequences, if they do, particularly if it escalates into the press or to regulators, can be very, very significant.
I spoke to a client actually who said that, okay, we are accepting this. If we get a fine or reputational damage from this, doesn't matter because we have critical production going on, and that's what we're focusing on. And if anything to do with GDPR will compromise that, then we'll take that risk, basically, essentially, which was I've never heard anyone say that directly, but anyway. But I also think that you said that we shouldn't just say no because it's new, right? Aren't we doing that a little bit with generative AI right now? Do we even know enough about it to legislate about it? I think there's still a lot of the AI labs are still trying to figure out what's actually going on here, and what is that we're regulating? Are we just regulating the use of it, or also regulating the technology itself? And aren't those two things intertwined in mysterious ways?
Well, again, it's a great question. I mean, I suppose when we say, we don't know much about generative AI, I think your point is that we don't know what's going on inside the generative AI.
Yeah, exactly.
We know we have these layers. We know that there's data passing backwards and forwards and all these weights and measures and what have you. We don't really know how it's inferring from what you've given it to generate an output.
You don't know how it's taking that walk on there. It's weighted graph, right? Yeah.
When you've got something that has 70 billion, 128 billion or whatever parameters, how could you ever possibly know? But by the same token, we do know that we can foresee certain harms from it. So we can foresee that people may be fooled into not realizing that they're dealing with an AI versus a person, and so that's why we have transparency rules around having to disclose when you're interacting with a chatbot. We know that there is harm from, or the potential at least for harm with synthetic content, whether it's kind of misinformation, disinformation, to be honest with you, one of the things I find really incredible, it's a bit of an aside, but when I go on social media now, I'm often watching these videos, animal videos or whatever, that I think are hilarious. And then my son walks in, he's like, yeah, that's fake.
Yeah.
And I don't know whether it's a generational thing, but he seems to be able to spot the fake videos much quicker than I can because, I don't know, there's a style or a pattern to it or whatever. But
they're getting more difficult to spot. I had the same thing. I started getting all these world animal photo competition posts all the time at one point, and I was like, they're all fake. These animals don't do that. This didn't happen. Just stop it, right?
You know a lot about my social media feed now, but there was a great one I was watching the other day. This corgi who was like sort of dancing to some hip hop music. His little backside was like flipping side to side with the music. It was so cute. But anyway, probably shouldn't have been taken in by that one. But you translate that kind of cute context into thinking, actually, forget the kind of cute, funny animals for a second, but actually think about that being like a news report.
But what if you were told that this is AI? Wouldn't you still watch it?
You might watch it, but I think there's a difference between watching something for entertainment and knowing it's false versus watching something and actually believing it to be real.
So what Meta just said, there might be AI content here, just like, a cookie box, we will have cookies. Are you okay with our data privacy? Yes, I'm fine with all of that, right? No one's reading it anyway. Is it the same thing you're doing?
Yeah, I'm not sure cookie banners are the best model to follow. I mean, I think everybody can universally agree, whether you are a vendor, whether you're a website publisher, whether you're a user, everybody hates the cookie banners. But
EULAs, all the EULAs in the world, who's reading them?
Oh, I mean, nobody is, are they? I mean, that's the point.
Do you feel you probably do read them, right?
Do I read only if I'm paid to read them?
Great.
But if you look at some of the stuff that's happening with, say, watermarking in images, for example, there's the little sort of CR symbol you see in the top of some images. It's relatively unobtrusive. It just puts people on notice that this isn't genuine content. And I think in a world where stuff can get retweeted a billion times very, very quickly, actually having that kind of that watermark so that we're able to distinguish between what is real and what isn't real, I think will be important.
But do you have any clue how easy it is to circumvent? It's like you just take a screenshot of it and then that's gone because it's in the metadata, right, of the file. So it's not a watermark, it's just metadata on the file. It's really easy to circumvent.
Yeah, and actually, I mean, one of the things that's been published in the back end of last year was the European Commission published this first draft of a transparency code of practice for generative AI. And actually what really struck me when I read it was that there was a lot in there about making sure that watermarking generative content is resistant to tampering. So, that's it. And so it has like this kind of layered approach to it where you embed sort of stuff within the metadata, you embed stuff within the actual watermarks within the content of the image itself. You maintain that sort of log of hashes and all that kind of thing, so people can go back and check content against your database of things that you've created. And then even it talks about sort of using more forensic techniques. So that I think is a real problem. But I suppose by the same token, I often kind of think back to this. There was this. I don't know if you ever watch or used to watch, Jon Stewart when he used to do, I forget the name of his show now on US television, but
Daily Show. The Daily Show,
yeah,
right? Yeah,
Daily Show. Thank you. That's the one. So
he's doing it again. Actually, he's actually there again. Anyway,
he's back on it. Okay, I used to love him. So I used to watch him a lot when I was in the States, and there was always one episode that really stuck with me where he was talking about gun control. And the difficulties of introducing that in the US and all the challenges there are. And I'm not going to wade into that debate particularly, but one of the things I do remember him saying was, there was some debate going on at the time about a piece of legislation that had failed, and he said, "Well, you know what they say: if at first you don't succeed, well, screw it." And I kind of think there's maybe something similar with the AI transparency stuff. We know some of the techniques we have now are not perfect. But I don't think that's an argument for not attempting them or not seeing how we can build on them and improve on them. So are there ways around it? Absolutely. But if we can even sort of, from the tide of stuff that is out there, start to tip the balance between people understanding between what is real and what is fake, I think we have to try going down that route and see how we can improve it. We've already seen so much of the consequences of that stuff not being done that I think we have to find ways to try and do it.
But we also want to sometimes believe. Anyway, but there's also this. I just think the whole problem with that, again, goes back to the malevolent actors, right? If you want to circumvent it, you can easily circumvent it because you'll have to have the providers of these image generators comply with it to add these kind of, if there's pixels just saying this is AI or something hidden, you can't see it. We still have to have someone put that into the images. And if a bad actor, say a state, wants to make fake images, they would obviously not comply with that rule, right? So.
Yeah, but at the same time, if you take sort of, I suppose, what the European Union is proposing, which is that you then got the ability to go back and actually check an image against some kind of repository that the providers have, where they can tell you instantly, okay, it wasn't marked, but we can tell you this is one of our images. Then for things like journalists and so on, that will become important. You can imagine. Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I'm going to guess they're going to have tools where any video or photo or something they're sent, they can immediately check and see whether was this an AI-generated image or not.
Oh, that sounds like an aggressive job. All the images in the world in a repository. Anyway, I think they need to ally with Google for that. But I think 4 years ago, this whole thing about generative AI seemed to be sort of sci-fi, right? And I just think how long does it take for lawmakers to fully grasp new technology in general? We saw a lot of example in the US. I remember I never talked about what we laughed about 10 years ago. I laughed a lot about all these lawmakers talking about Facebook back then and having Mark Zuckerberg in for hearings, in Congress, and they had no clue what Facebook was, right? And I can't help but feel that we're doing the same thing with the AI Act and all the other things, sitting there with lawmakers who have no clue what's going on. And can we even talk about something like a lawmaker epistemology here or something like that?
So, I mean, I guess there's even more recent examples of the sort of the Mark Zuckerberg situation with him, going before, I can't remember if it was Congress or Senate or whatever, where he was getting asked questions like, how do I send an email over WhatsApp and so on, and those kinds of things, they do worry you. I suppose, often what you're hearing there are the politicians rather than the civil servants that are maybe drafting these items of legislation. But, it's a fair challenge, I think. If you take something like the GDPR and you think about, how that developed, I saw the very first leaked draft of the GDPR at the back end of 2011 before it was officially published. And presumably there was a lot of work that had gone into even reaching that stage, before then. And then, the official draft was published in 2012. It didn't become adopted as a piece of legislation until 2016. So that was another 4 years worth of negotiation and lobbying and committee hearings and all that kind of stuff. And then it didn't enter into effect for another couple of years. So, become applicable is the legal term. It entered into effect in 2016 and became applicable in 2018. So, you take that from beginning to end, that's a good 6 years. And that is, that's an eon in technology terms. I guess we have a sort of few tools to combat that in the sort of legislative arsenal. One is that we try to make legislation technology neutral. So, what we look at from the European lawmakers' perspective is to say, okay, we have this thing like the Charter of Fundamental Rights. We know there are certain rights that we need to protect, whether that's the right to data protection, the right to equal opportunities in employment, the right to property, all of those kinds of things. And what we look to do is to say, we need to create rules that ensure that these rights are protected. So the sort of technology neutrality, I think, is one approach we take to it. The other is obviously there is a huge amount of consultation that goes into creating any of these laws, and there's a lot of lobbying from all sides. There's civil society, industry, so on. All of that stuff is taken, and from the limited exposure I've had to it, that people work very, very hard to get this stuff right. Do they always get it perfect? No, absolutely not. But I think the challenge is, is that length of time, honestly. I say it, it's a lifetime in computing terms. But if you take something like the AI Act as a good example, and when it was first proposed, it had nothing in there about general purpose AI models. It was all sort of, prohibited high risk transparency requirements. Then suddenly ChatGPT happened. Overnight, there was this mad scramble to sort of shoehorn something in around general purpose AI models into the AI Act. We got it done. The act was passed. And nowadays we're all worrying about agents, which aren't, sort of explicitly directly regulated by the AI Act. And again, there's that whole argument that maybe it doesn't matter so much because we have all of these other rules, and so working together, they effectively, can be said to regulate agents, or maybe agents are something new where we need something extra. I don't know. But I think that the challenge is both in the initial lawmaking stage of understanding the technology, and then once you have a law adopted, doing the software patches to maintain that law and keep it up to date so that it continues to evolve as the technology does.
I think the weird thing is that a law is also sometimes something we need to make a law about this, right? And then that becomes the task. And what if we wanted to sort of change that into a completely different focus? You said it just happened with the general purpose AI, but it could also been, I sometimes think that with GDPR, for instance, that is too heavily focused on personal data, and there's other kind of data also out there, and a lot of proprietary data. I think the problem is when you're doing IT projects, there's always this consideration about GDPR, which is much heavier than the consideration around sometimes proprietary data, which is where you can sort of do more, right? And of course that's more difficult to legislate about, but really that's just as important, just as sensitive today as well, right? And we have IP rights rules and all that, but do you get my point, right? I think sometimes there is this task also, this focus here.
Yeah. I mean, it's a really interesting point, and it's actually something that I think reflects how I think my profession is evolving. Because historically, I'd always thought of myself as being a privacy lawyer. That's what I do. I do privacy. It's protecting people's personal data rights. But nowadays, I think we're increasingly talking about not being just privacy lawyers. We talk about being data lawyers because the regulation is expanding into other areas. So we have, the Data Act, which is this new piece of legislation that comes in. It regulates data relating to Internet of Things devices, to data and cloud services. And the idea basically is that if you're a customer of those things, you're a user of them, you still have the right to have access to that data and to be able to port it into other products and services in order to be able to innovate. The regulatory objective is to unlock data so that more kind of innovation and sharing and so on can go around it. That, I guess, is maybe a slightly different point from what you're saying, because really what we're talking about there is the opportunity for customers and third parties to get access to data and use it for further innovation, as opposed to what you're talking about, which I think is the proprietary end of it, where you say, hey, this is my IP. I don't want to give you access to that data. So it's in terms of how the industry is evolving, I do think there is more of a move towards not just regulating personal data now, but regulating data more broadly. I think when it comes to sort of the proprietary stuff, I think intellectual property laws will still, at least for the short term, be the primary tool through which we do that. But
sort of like the legislators sort of realized that, but it's all data. All the data in the world. Data is an asset. And GDPR, GDPR is a problem because of spies and all that. There was this case on the US spying, wasn't that? I think that was what sort of got the GDPR into gear, right? That there was the usage of a lot of German politicians wasn't. I don't remember exactly, but wasn't it some kind of intelligence operations that sort of knew things about Merkel or something like that?
This was sort of reportedly the NSA sort of potentially tapping the phone lines of leading politicians in Europe and so on, including Angela Merkel, and using that for sort of both national security but also potential economic advantage and things like that.
And then data became important, right? And now with the Data Act, are we now taking data seriously? It's 2026. And it's the Data Act finally where the European politicians say we actually take all data seriously. Is that what you're trying to say as well?
I think, so there's a couple of things that have happened. So firstly, the GDPR, I think, has expanded beyond what people perhaps imagined at the outset. So it's supposed to, as a law, it's supposed to regulate personal data. What we've seen over time is that there are two schools of thought really on what personal data should be. There is a sort of a regulatory view, which is that it should be as broad as it possibly can be. And any data that in any way, shape or form has somehow perhaps originated from an individual, we need to treat as personal data. Originated from or been inferred about or derived from it relates to an individual and is protected by the GDPR. That, I think, is a very different view from what maybe was the original legislative intention, but certainly is different from what from what industry would like, which is to say a lot of this data really isn't we're not trying to learn stuff about people. We're trying to learn stuff about patterns. And so the data may originate from people, but we're not trying to look at it at that individual level. But the challenge with that has always been that, well, actually, if it comes from people or in some way links back to them, we still treat that data as being personal data. And so all of the rules that go with it are regulated by the GDPR. And a lot of the clients I deal with will say, well, it's okay because we hash the data or we anonymize it. And we then have to get into quite careful conversations with them saying, well, hash data is still a type of personal data. And when you say anonymize, what do you really mean by that? And often what people mean is not anonymized at all. They just mean they deleted someone's first name or something like that from a database entry.
Oh, but he's the only one who owns an old Volkswagen something in this area anyway, and we all know who he is. And now you've deleted his name, but I can just see what car he owns, right? So it's...
Exactly. And so there's, if you've had any way of sort of inferring or linking stuff back to an individual as personal data, I think that's the result of that has been that the GDPR has ended up regulating a lot more, I think, than perhaps people envisaged or thought it would. And that leads into the kind of cases you were talking about, like the Google Analytics stuff, where you've got regulators saying, well, actually, Google Analytics is collecting an IP address and actually it's transferring it to the US. And two things. One, we think an IP address is personal data. And two, we think at that point in time, we think the US is unsafe. And therefore, these transfers are just not allowed. And it's an enormous risk. There are technical arguments around all that stuff, but I feel like it's a misplaced emphasis. There's the proportionality in the direction is all wrong. Losing someone's hospital records is a big deal. IP addresses going to the US, not so much. But
enormous risk, yeah, exactly.
So a lot of data that you wouldn't have historically thought of as off the top of your head as being personal has been swept under the GDPR. But at the same time, to your point, yes, EU regulators are now looking and saying, well, actually, there is value in all of this other data that is non-personal, and therefore we need to make sure we create rules and protections for that as well. I think one of the big challenges that I'm anticipating as a lawyer, though, is how you tell the difference between the two, because if the breadth of personal data is so wide that it includes a lot of things you wouldn't think of as being personal, how do you know when one falls under one regime and when the other falls under the other regime? An example like somebody threw at me the other day was, telemetry data about self-driving vehicles. You say, well, actually, that's not personal data, it's about the vehicle. And you're like, well, but the vehicle has a driver and it has passengers in it. So actually, is it personal data about their trip or, their method of interacting with the vehicle or so on? And, you can make arguments, it falls into both camps.
There's a human in everything, right?
Yeah. Exactly.
In the end, right? That's why we do things, right? But also, the Data Act. You said something about the cloud services as well. I think I remember you speaking about that as well when you were in Copenhagen. I have not yet myself touched too much upon the Data Act and what it actually means. But how does that sort of does it also collide with the GDPR, or is it adding a new perspective to it? And what does this whole cloud service thing actually mean for enterprises?
Well, there's sort of two components to the Data Act. The first is dealing with sort of regulation of Internet of Things devices. So we call them connected products and the related services that go with those. And it basically says that if you're a B2B or a B2C customer of a connected product or the services that are affiliated with it. So you can think, maybe your sort of your Amazon Ring doorbell and the cloud services, all the hosting of video you've captured. It basically says you have to tell people what kind of data you're collecting up front and how they can access that data and how they can share it with other parties. So that's, but it's not just necessarily, that's maybe a personal example. That could be industrial machinery or so on as well. So that's one aspect of the Data Act. The other aspect relates to cloud services. The Data Act calls them data processing services, but essentially what we're talking about there again is B2B or B2C customers of a cloud service. They put data into that cloud, or maybe they put applications into it. And then what it's basically saying is that they get the ability on a very short amount of notice to cancel their cloud service and take all of their data out and port it over to another cloud service. And the idea is to kind of prevent, vendor lock-in with these really big cloud organizations who have, hugely onerous terms. That means customers can never get out of them. And it's all the data held in proprietary formats. And even if they wanted to move, they couldn't because the data wouldn't be in the right format. So what the Data Act does is to say, you've got to give people these contractual rights to move, on as little as 2 months' notice. And you've got to make sure the data is exported in a portable format, in an open format, basically, that they can import into a new provider. Commercially, that could be massively impactful because a lot of these vendors will have entered 2, 3, 5 year deals with their customers, and then find their customers can get out of it on 2 months' notice inside that period. And so that does a lot for sort of future revenue recognition. It also means, potentially there's a lot of work to be done switching data from proprietary formats into non-proprietary formats as well. And you can see the regulatory objective behind it. I think if you're a customer, it's a hugely positive thing for you. But on the vendor side of that equation, it's a real challenge. But it goes very much back to the point we're making at the outset, which is, but does it even matter if there's no regulatory enforcement? And the really interesting thing about the Data Act at the moment is that although each of the member states around the EU was meant to have implemented it, in September last year, actually the overwhelming majority have not yet done so. So there's no regulatory body set up. There's no sort of penalty regime set up. And so what we're seeing from a commercial angle is that there's been a fairly muted response to it from the kind of the vendor community. We were predicting it was going to be a hugely impactful piece of legislation, and I think it is, but only when the enforcement and the national implementation is there.
To me, it just sounds like competition laws for cloud providers, basically, or something like that. Isn't that correct?
Yeah, it is absolutely serving a competition aim.
Yeah, it's just just looking at it from, but also again back to what I said earlier, that it sort of seems like they're realizing that data is important. Data is actually
and interesting.
On a whole
there's even
important.
stuff. There's actually a provision within the Data Act which actually talks about preventing. Very similar to the rules we have in the EU about not sending personal data to non-EU countries unless you have protections in place. There's very similar rules about preventing non-EU government authorities from having access to EU non-personal data because there's concerns about intellectual property theft and so on. So absolutely, it's recognizing the value of that data.
That's actually very interesting. That's exactly what I wanted, and what one of my questions was all about. Proprietary data. Are we talking about that again? And we are, which actually makes me very happy. I don't know if it makes me happy because I always felt like, as you said, there's so much non-consequential, IP addresses to the US, and then there's something that's much more, someone stealing windmill IP, and that's not even regulated the same way. Of course, it's stealing, but it just seems like the focus has been completely off, and I still think that we haven't found, it doesn't sound like we found the balance or the what do you call it, the thin red line. Is that what we call it? No, that's the silver lining.
The thin red line. Well, I think in the UK we'll call it thin red line, something along those lines. There's a TV show in the UK years ago that was called The Thin Blue Line, which was a police drama. So I'm trying not to confuse it with that.
But what should actually be the biggest headaches for governance professionals in the market right now, also in AI especially now, because that's also what we're talking about. And we started talking about, should that be data protection? Should that be the fines they can get, or should they be looking at something like shadow AI that everyone's talking about as well?
It's an interesting one. I think there's probably two core challenges that I see, and I'm going to steer clear of the laws and the fines because they are what they are. But I think the real challenges are absolutely the shadow IT piece. It's a huge problem, and it's what I've experienced here at Digiphile as well. Because there are two ways it comes in. I think one is people just using tools that they're not telling you about, and trying to keep an eye on that and make sure that they they're not using personal accounts with LLMs and uploading commercially sensitive information, all that kind of stuff. The other element is just the upgrade button on tools that you have. So we had this desktop piece of PDF software, Digiphile, and of course we get client documents. We open it up in the PDF software, runs locally on our computers. No file-based elements of it. So we were good with it. And then one day we get this button that appears in it that says summarize.
AI enabled. Woo!
Yeah, exactly. They built AI into it, sort of just pushed it out overnight through a software update. And when you looked into it, basically it was sending data to servers in China if you hit the summarize button. So I immediately had to send around a thing like nobody hit summarize, and we had to ditch the software because we just couldn't take that risk. But I think you can foresee that all of the every piece of software is going to be AI enabled. I mean, it's pretty close to that already, to be honest with you. I think every piece of software people use and every service they use is going to have some AI element to it, and
none of them are local yet. No, and they're all cloud, right?
Yeah, well, yeah, like they're all cloud. But so you can go through a procurement process. And you think, okay, we bought this piece of software 5 years ago. We're comfortable with it. We maybe up to we just let people use it, and then suddenly you discover it's got a new AI element that you weren't aware of, and all your stuff in clicking the AI button in it. So I think that shadow AI and the upgrade piece is a real challenge. How you get visibility of that and how you manage it. The other piece I think that is a constant challenge for my clients is getting senior level sponsorship, actually, because there is a lot of senior level support in organizations to adopt AI and to adopt it as quickly as you possibly can and to integrate it into everything that you possibly can. There's not a massive amount of support for the compliance aspects of that. And typically a lot of the organizations that I end up speaking to tell me that they've had some mandate from their CEO that everybody must adopt AI, and their compliance program has basically been told, don't stand in the way of AI adoption. If we don't adopt AI quick enough, if we don't innovate quick enough, we'll lose to our competitors. And so all of this compliance stuff doesn't matter if we don't have a business to run. And that's kind of, often the mindset you see in a lot of organizations.
Yeah.
And so I think overcoming that and getting the support you need as a sort of compliance professional to make sure that you are rolling these things out in a sensible way. And I know you've talked about this as well, Lasse, the kind of making sure you're not just adopting AI for AI's sake, but you're actually looking at, not just having it because it's a shiny new toy, but because there is actually it's solving a problem, that's what we need to make sure. And certainly I think with a lot of organizations I see, there's still that adopting AI for AI's sake rather than thinking about, is it really sensible to adopt this? And actually, how do we ensure we do so in a risk managed way?
I think one of the funniest things is that I spoke to Nils Peter from Basico, where I work also on this, and he's also been on the podcast a year ago. And we often speak about this, that people are asking him also to write policies that sort of approve Copilot or ChatGPT or something like that. But what he's always coming back to saying is that, I can't approve a tool, I can only approve a use case. And that means, you always have to have this discussion, right? You have to constantly have this discussion with your compliance officer. And that's maybe why companies also say, we don't want to do this, or let's just move at speed because we need to adopt this. And that's in some way, that's also how the big AI provider companies have been operating in the market, isn't it? If you think about something like copyright.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know the detail of quite how they've trained their models, but certainly there seems to be a lot of reason to believe
they didn't write the data themselves. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah. I have to be. I'm a lawyer. I have to be careful what I say, but yes, there is all evidence to point there has not been a massive amount of respect, at least historically, for ingesting copyright.
We tried this music generating software, right? Where we're like, can you make a song that sounds like Hansi Hinterseer, the German Schlager star? And no, I can't do that. I don't know who he is. He replies back, and then you're like, make some German country Schlager, and then you get Hansi Hinterseer, and you're like, okay, come on, guys. How stupid do you think we are, right?
It's funny when I was first introduced to ChatGPT, and I was absolutely blown away the first time I tried it, but it was because somebody sent me a thing saying. They just tried telling it to create a blog in the style of Phil Lee, and they sent me this thing, and I read the blog, and I was like, actually, this is pretty good. Maybe things I would change, but overall, this is pretty solid. And yeah, I just never realized that AI had advanced that far. Particularly, I don't know if you know this, but my degree was in computer science, and
I didn't know that actually. That's nice.
Yeah, well, I studied computing at university, and I actually remember I had to do AI lectures. So you're talking, when was it, 1996, 1999. And we actually I remember having an AI lecturer stand up in front of us and say, basically AI will never achieve the wonderful things that, people think it do, that it will never be human-like or all of this kind of stuff. And, its use cases will be generally quite limited. And so I'd actually kind of, this was a top university I went to, very smart lecturers. And so I came away, and I've always had that mindset that, AI will never really amount to much. It's a bit like a sort of a disapproving parent, and never really amount to much. And then ChatGPT happened. I was like, wow, this is what it feels like to live in the future.
But I think there's also this 4 years ago you'd say that AI is in PowerPoint, and then when it's working, it's called software. It has a name. AI is only when it's in PowerPoint. Then it's a dream or something like that. To some extent, still a bit. Whenever we talk AI as for AI's sake, it's still very unspecific, and it's very not, it's very difficult to measure. But when you put it in, I'm always talking about, let's put AI into the process instead of the process into AI, because the last one is a weird thing to do, right? But I also think that well, actually, when I think about it, there's one other challenge as well that I see
that I think is quite difficult to overcome is that actually what the boundary is between one AI system and another. Because, we know that AI systems can integrate models, other AI systems can integrate, downstream AI systems and also upstream AI systems, I should say. So, like, where do you distinguish the responsibilities between one AI system and another? And, I've had sort of examples where people say to me, okay, we've got this system and it integrates maybe a couple of models. And one of those models we think is, is perfectly fine. The other one we think is high risk. Does that mean the system as a whole is high risk? They're two separate systems where one of them is absolutely fine and we only need to worry about the other system. And then, you can sort of layer those things on top of one another. So you can say, well, actually, okay, we integrate this system into another system. And, how do you work out the boundaries of delineation of responsibility? And the stuff, within the AI Act, it actually deals with it in a fairly sort of glib way where it sort of says, oh, and if you modify an AI system or you integrate another AI system, you can become a provider of it. And you're like, but what does that actually mean? At what point do you step into the shoes and suddenly take on responsibility? That I think is going to be a real challenge for a lot of people as well, particularly where they are integrating either generative tools or other vendor AI products into their own products.
Yeah, exactly. Figure out who has responsibility. The chain is just expanding so much because there are these cloud providers as well, right? But also, but back to the point we talked about also before about, this whole, you thought it was really nice what it came up with. I think that I've talked about that a little bit as well, that back in 2022 when it came out, I was like, this is perfect. Like you just said, it's almost a perfect blog post for Philly. But today I'm like, nah, there's always something off, right? You're getting more and more critical as you go, right? I don't know.
Yeah, it's funny. You actually do. You're absolutely right. It's
You don't necessarily with the dog videos, I know, but the corgis, if they dance to hip hop, you're like, oh, that's nice, right?
Yeah, I think it's the level of expectation you have, isn't it? I think, back in the day, you just didn't think, our experiences were going to Google and typing sort of, 3 or 4 just disjointed search terms and the hope Google would return as a relevant page. The idea of sort of typing in natural language and getting some kind of explanation back where it digested everything and, gave you an answer, that was just not something you expected. So when you encounter it for the first time, it seems massively impressive. But then when you spend more time with it, as you say, you start to notice all the things that are wrong with it or that you wish it did better. And so you become perhaps more critical with time.
I think we become sort of like, I was saying, what is the future? We're going to be like royals, I say, no, that was not the cake I wanted. I wanted a different cake, but you can get any cake, but you get very specific. You become very picky, right? I think the pickiness is going to be a future trait.
I think also the use cases are different. I mean, I'm sure, well, maybe it's just me, but I kind of assume most people's first experience of ChatGPT was spending a few days playing on it, getting it to write poems or songs or things like, it's not something you were ever going to rely on professionally, just stuff you were having entertainment value with and showing to your friends and family. It's like, how cool is this? But, now we're kind of moving into the domain where you're getting it to, I don't know, write emails for you, write blog posts, check advice, write press releases, all those kinds of things. And actually you need a degree more confidence in what it's doing there so that you become more critical of what it produces.
Yeah, but I think I'm just wondering if there is a limit to that, right? Or if we'll keep on being more critical. If you'll always, like a royalty or like a partner at a business company, you always have this PowerPoint could always be better, no matter what. Right.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, when I was first promoted to partner years ago, I remember actually one of the very first times I had to supervise a senior associate in my team. They brought me a piece of advice. It was actually pretty good, but it wasn't the way I would have done it, and so I ended up sort of redlining huge amounts of it. And they came and saw me afterwards because I think I'd offended them by being so extensive in what I'd done. And actually, I didn't need to be. And I remember talking to my boss at the time, who said to me, "Look, you don't, with every piece of work, need to aim for perfection. You need to aim for good enough. And you need to understand that people are going to do things in a different voice to the way that you would do it." And it's advice that always stuck with me. And I try to bring it now to anybody that I manage or supervise. But I think maybe that's the approach we need to have with AI. When we get to the point, if we're using these tools to generate stuff for us, it doesn't necessarily need to be exactly in our voice or exactly, 100% accurate in everything it does, but for the use case in which we're using it, is it at a good enough level?
Yeah, exactly. And it's all about, someone said once that, if you get an A+, you've done too much. Just you get an A, you've done too much. You could have passed easier. But then
with medical diagnosis, I want the A+ student.
Yes, but also, there's also the other side of it. And I think that's a partner at my current company who says that, it has to look like we cost the money that we cost, right? So you have to make sure it's good enough, right? It's not good enough. It's not good enough. It has to be more than good enough, right? All the time.
Mind you, I could get into law firm philosophy on that one because I think sometimes people think it has to look like what we paid for means, it has to be sort of beautifully laid out, and we have to have, we have to focus on the grammar, but there's not enough focus then on the usability of the advice. It becomes more about the appearance of the advice, and I tend to prefer focusing on the usability.
Yeah, then it becomes more about, legitimizing something or authority more than it becomes about the content itself, right? Exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes. I want to ask you a very difficult question, Phil. Can a system be accountable?
I think it depends what you mean by accountable. I mean, if you mean, can a system
Okay. Phil. Hi, Phil. This is the European Commission calling. We want to make an agent act. Can you help us? Can a system be accountable, Phil?
I really wouldn't want to be tasked with creating the agent act. It sounds far too difficult. I mean, if you're meaning, can the system be responsible? Can it take responsibility for the things it does? I mean, I think that in lawmaking we would always push responsibility to a person, so it would always be who developed that system or who was using that system, and we'd always look to do that. In terms of, can systems get better at explaining what they're doing and how they're reaching the decisions they are, I would very much hope they can do. I mean, again, I'm not the academic expert on this, but I know there's a lot of research going into how do we make the machines actually explain what they're doing, whether it's sort of basic chain of reasoning stuff or going in something more sophisticated where something is actually producing interim outputs where it's actually explaining logic as it goes through stuff. Those things I think will become more important. And I do think we need to move more towards that, so that we're not just putting blind faith in the machine. But in terms of sort of legal apportionment of responsibility, I think it would always have to fall on a combination of the developer or the user of the software. And what you would look for, I guess, is, did the manufacturer fall below the standards we would expect of them or the developer in creating this AI? And then in terms of the user, you look at, were they using the AI in the way that it was meant to be used? Or, so if you take a car, for example, you don't hold the car responsible for the people it kills. You hold the manufacturer if the brakes failed, or you hold the driver if they drove it recklessly.
Yeah, but what if this? But in these cases, right, these models are, stochastic, right? They're kind of semi-chaotic as well, right? And you can always reduce that, but there's always a chance that they do something that they say something that's not supposed to be said, right? And I just think that, we can add all the reasoning. You can see how it got to that. Maybe we get more insight into how it's actually reasoning. If we at some point in the future would be able to say exactly where it went wrong when it walked on its weighted, took the walk on its weighted graph to produce the result. But then in the end saying that it's always a human being, I think I had Robert Fuchs on the podcast back in the spring last year. And he said that, he introduced this concept that I'm always super fascinated by and I keep returning to, the human crumple zone, right? Where instead of having the machine or the car sort of crumple to protect the human, we put a human there to crumple to protect the machine, because the machine, and it seems like when we're introducing it here in large scale agentic setups, how can any human ever really know what's going on? And if it's what if you updated a prompt here, Phil, and I updated another one over here, and it's sort of, those two together sort of compounded to create a weird error, and none of us ever knew who's responsible in an agent, because the machine actually interpreted them in a different way. We had no clue. We couldn't have foreseen it, right?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the way we try to deal with it is, if you're looking at it from an AI Act perspective, you would say, you have these categories at risk. We know some of them are what we consider to be doing high risk AI, and that's why we need to have a human in the loop, so that if before it does anything that is particularly consequential, we have a check-in with a human who can, authorize or intervene.
Who can become the scapegoat, I'd say, as well, right?
Well, I guess again it will depend on what is the level of information that the AI is giving to them. So that, there's one thing about the person who makes the decision and authorizes the AI to do what it does. There's the other, but if you have an AI that, let's say, manifestly lies to the person, so let's go ahead and do this, it'll be absolutely fine. And the person says, okay, I approve it, but the AI was lying in that, intentionally misleading. Or designed to mislead, then yes, you would expect the manufacturer to be, or the developer to be, responsible for that. But I think law is ultimately a blunt instrument. I think one of the big challenges with law is always that you are trying to create a tool that manages society as a whole, but it always means that in any individual case, you can always find a reason to say that it's been unfair or that it hasn't worked well. And what you're trying to do is get the best results you possibly can across the population as an entirety. And this goes up at the point, I guess, where you realise that the law isn't working, or where it's systematically failing in certain areas. Then you need to revisit that from a regulatory standpoint, from a court standpoint as well. What you would hope is that you don't just have the rules and the enforcement, but also you have regulators and courts who can exercise discretion, who can say that, maybe IP addresses to the US isn't the most important thing we need to be enforcing right now. But this over here, where we've got an AI agent that has been encouraging traders to commit financial fraud, that is a big deal, and that's the one we need to be going after.
Yeah, like you recommend it to someone that they kill themselves, or you can eat this poisonous mushroom. It's perfectly edible. That meme that's been going around, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. So what you would want, I think, is a system of rules that have been designed as best they can, that adapt as necessary, and regulators and courts who apply discretion to make sure that they prioritize and enforce them in discretionary ways, where they look at the things that are really causing harm. I guess the weak link in all of that is, regulators and legislators and lawyers and courts, all of us at the end of the day, we're human, and we're not in any way, shape or form consistent about the way that we do things.
No.
Or even make good decisions sometimes. And so you do end up with these cases where it feels that priorities have been misplaced, or we treat one case differently to how we treated a completely different case. And I think those things will always exist.
Phil, I think this is a terrible agent act you've just written. I don't think you're being decisive enough at all.
That's why I advise on the law rather than actually create the law.
I think you're like, we have to have some humans seeing if this is critical or not, and then you figure it out. It's already in the AI Act. I don't care.
If you look at in the AI Act, you look at the stuff that's classified as high risk. It is stuff that is causing physical harm to people, or mental harm to people, or it's causing damage to properties, or it's.
So do we need an agent act? Right? You said before that they didn't. The agents that didn't have it. Do you think we need it? 'Cause I think two things, right? We've been criticizing a little bit that overlaps and complexity. You said overlaps and different interactions between the different regulations and all that. And then you said also that, maybe they didn't have the agents in it. Maybe do they need the agents? And what if we now just say, okay, let's make an agent thing? Then you go back, but there's already regulated here and here. And then we realize also how extremely difficult it is to actually make that regulation. So firstly, I always love it when people quote back to me what I've said. That's brilliant, right?
No, so I've got a few principles, I guess. Just because something's hard doesn't mean it's not worthwhile. So I do believe, we always ought to try. So creating these laws might be difficult, but that's probably rightly so. They should be difficult, because if we're applying any level of thought to them, they should be hard. Do we need a separate AI Agent Act or a separate set of rules for AI agents? I actually wouldn't pretend I know the answer to that at the moment. I can foresee that there may be weird and wonderful things agents will do that I can't imagine at the moment. But there is a lot of regulation out there currently. There is all the prohibited, the high risk stuff under the AI Act. A lot of the big concerns we have about agents are to do with cybersecurity. If we're going to let them have access to our emails and our calendars and all that kind of stuff, we've got a lot of cybersecurity rules out there already as well. So those things can apply. And of course, we've got all the GDPR rules for protecting personal data. I think, one thing what I would hope legislators are doing is kind of speaking to experts and saying, is this enough? Do these address the rules well enough? And, and also that we learn from experience. So if we see things are going wrong and the agents are, breaking into all sorts of systems and entering false entries into other systems and all that kind of stuff, that we would respond to that and say, okay, is it just that the regulatory rulebook has become too diverse and complex, that we're not seeing simple, clear rules that say, when you're using an agent, this is how it needs to work? And in those cases, then I would hope we would adapt and create the rules to deal with those issues.
Yeah, so basically, in a way, we're saying that, do we have the rules that are good enough to sort of guide and sort of direct you towards doing things the right way and the way we want you to do in accordance with our values? And are they good enough to also at the same time define what's malevolent behavior? Because we can never get rid of those, no matter how much law how many regulations we make. We can't get rid of hackers or scammers or whatever they want to do, right? You can't get rid of those anyway. So
At the moment, we have a list of outcomes that we don't want to happen.
Yeah.
And it may be that we discover new outcomes over time that we also don't want to happen, that we need to expand that list and address rules to deal with it. But at the moment, we have a pretty good list.
And at the moment, we know what's criminal behavior, and we can criminalize criminal behavior more than it's already criminal, because it's
well, criminal behavior is only what we've defined to be criminal, but yeah.
but you get my point, right? We should forbid criminal behavior. Yeah, okay, we get that. But I think sometimes that's what people are arguing, right? When they want more laws, they said they want to criminalize things that are already criminal, which is kind of
and I think there's a politician thing there. You sort of get into power and you think, oh, okay, there's this new thing that's hitting the headlines. Let's create a rule around it without asking yourself the question: do we already have enough there to already regulate it?
There's also a lot of marketing laws. Also, there's tons of laws everywhere guiding everything around this, right? It's actually I feel a little bit, I feel like what do you call it? Fear of heights when we're talking here, because I really feel like I'm standing on top of a very large mountain of law and things that could go wrong, and you have no clue about. Do you feel that way sometimes as well, Phil?
I think one of the things that keeps me most up at night is the concern that I don't know anywhere near enough. And, there's a lot of law out there, there's a lot of rules out there. And of course, to be able to apply the law to the technologies, I need to understand the technologies as well.
Your use cases, yeah, exactly.
And I think I was actually, when I started university, I remember one of my very first lectures, the lecturer saying to us, right now you've probably finished school and you think you kind of basically know all the knowledge there is to know. But, over the course of the next few years here, we will show you that everything you learn here, you only know the tiniest corner of this entire universe of knowledge of things that there is to be known. And I think as I've gotten older, I've only become more and more aware of how much I don't know that I really wish I did know and that I had the time to learn. And, I guess that's true of all of us. We're all just trying to do the best with the knowledge that we have.
And how much we do know that we wish we didn't know or didn't have any use for anyway, like song lyrics. But that's another thing. But Phil, on that, right, and also on the complexity of that, I just a final, and I know it's a really big question, but I've also discussed this before on the podcast. Will we need lawyers in the future? It seems like right now what we're talking about, we're increasing the complexity with every new technology, and then we need even more lawyers, right? But there's a lot of people in the US saying that, we don't need lawyers in the future. Why do you think they say that?
I think there's a lot of vested interest of people saying we won't need lawyers in the future. There's a lot of vested interest with lawyers. People say we will need lawyers in the future. My personal take on it is that we will always need lawyers. I just don't know that we will always need lawyers to do the same task that they do today. So, I often think my role quite often is almost something akin to being a psychologist. Often I'm trying to sort of work out, I've got a client who wants to do something, there's some kind of internal blockage or some external group that's not happy with them, or there's some contract negotiation they can't get through. And really what I'm trying to do is understand what are the human behavioral levers I need to put on in order to enable this to happen. And sometimes that's creating greater safety nets around things. Sometimes it's understanding why somebody's upset and apologizing for the things that have aggrieved them. It can be any number of things. Sometimes it's knowing what you need to say to somebody in order for them to give you the budget to go ahead and do the thing you need to do. So, and I think those things are so inherently human that I have a hard time believing AI will ever do it. And even if they could, while humans remain in control, I just think, humans will always want to deal with other humans more than they will want to deal with machines telling them what to do.
But I also like what you're saying, because Laura Jeffers Greenberg, we spoke about this as well, right? That as long as there's conflict, collaboration, co-creation, something like that, you'll need a lawyer or you need someone to translate between entities, right? And that's essentially sort of the same thing you're saying. You're saying calling yourself a therapist to figure out how do we land these different ambitions and agendas, right?
Absolutely. But do you need lawyers to proofread every document or to paginate documents? I mean, when I first started, as a trainee many, many years ago, one of my jobs was working on this big litigation case where we had literally an entire room full of documents where it was evidence in a case where they didn't have page numbers on the printed binders. And I had these stickers with numbers on, and I had to go turn through every single page and put a sticker to give the page number on the page. And, and I forget what my charge out rate was then. I was probably I don't know, 200 quid an hour or something along the lines just to do that. Do you need lawyers to do that? No, you absolutely don't need lawyers to do that. So there'll be a lot of those kind of routine things that I think AI will take away from us and will maybe improve. And maybe even some of the really basic contracts, like sort of, non-disclosure agreements and so on, I think AI may end up.
Yeah, as I mentioned, the EULAs as well, right, to some extent, right?
Yeah. I think there's a lot of stuff, that stuff they will probably take away from us with time. But I sort of welcome that in a way, because I think actually enables me, it takes away some of the stuff I really don't like doing and enables me to focus on more of the hard problem solving that I enjoy.
I haven't spoken to a lawyer yet who's been like, I really don't hope they take away my NDAs. Because I love them. I haven't heard of that from anyone yet. So,
it's probably, there's probably a lot of lawyers who secretly feel this, but every now and again you get like the easy agreement that comes into your
yeah. But if you're a senior, and you're making money from making money from putting the juniors and the paralegals to it, then you like it, right?
Some days you just wake up and you're a bit tired, or you haven't really got the energy for it, and you're like, oh, it's a nice easy one today, I'll do that one.
So I really don't hope you feel like this has been one of the easy ones to do this episode with me, Phil, because I've tried my best to ask you some difficult questions as well, and I will be sending your suggestion for an Agent Act to the European Commission. No, I won't. Please. There's just nothing in it. Have someone evaluate if it's worth it. Anyway, but Phil, I think this has been a terrific conversation. I've been extremely happy to have you here, and I'm just happy that we got to do this episode. So thank you so much for sharing your insights and your experience and your knowledge about these very, very complex regulations with me and with the audience. So I have a final question for you, Phil, and you already alluded to it. That's become a theme, actually, that most of my guests in the last 2 or 3, 4 episodes have been like saying a constant before I asked them, which is really weird. And you also did it. There is a constant, and you should like stop doing that. Just don't answer the constant question before I ask you, okay? But
no, I think I told you the one I wasn't going to give as the constant.
Good. But I just love the way people are sort of alluding to it. I have to give the constant in the end. Oh, what's it going to be? What's it going to be? And I think the last one is not out yet, but it will be out this week. She actually gave me 2. Which is totally unheard of. But anyway, don't do that, Phil. But but I have a final question. Are you ready for that one?
Yes, I am ready for it. I've been thinking hard on it.
Great. Phil, what is the only constant?
In my line of work, I think I would say that innovators will always innovate, regulators will always regulate, and I think those two things will always exist in tension. And I think that's the way it should be. I think it's right that they do. When I first came to law, I had a sort of slightly naive law school view on things, which was that, companies will always, I maybe watched Erin Brockovich or something, and I'd had this idea that companies will always try to pollute rivers, and good regulators will always come in and try and clean up the rivers, and, maybe try to export that to a technology type view of the world. But actually, what I see over time, and, with a lot more experience under my belt now, is that I see companies who genuinely try to do these amazing things where they're so caught up in the technology of what they're trying to achieve, and do these kind of huge scientific advances, or leaps in usability or tools or whatever it happens to be, and they're really excited about it, and they try to put them out there. But at the same time, you have the regulators who are very concerned about things we have in the EU, the fundamental rights. How is this going to impact people? What harms is this going to create? How do we prevent that without understanding the technology always? But at the same time, the technology companies often don't understand the societal consequences of their tools. They're more focused on creating the cool technology than they are on what are going to be the consequences of that. So those two things exist in tension, because the tools come out, the regulators try to regulate it, and the tension arises as a consequence of that. But I really, really do believe that's the right way that it should be, because I think it is precisely through that tension you start to land on what the right answer should be. You never want everything to be waved through. You never want everything to be banned. You want that tension to arise, so that the kind of combination of innovation and regulation lands on tools that are innovative, yes, but are also responsibly innovative. So the tension between innovators and regulators, I think that would be my only constant.
That's a really, really great answer, and it made me think, that this tension between innovators and regulators is like the conversation you need to have with society, with history, with tradition as well, right? That's the whole point of it, isn't it? So you can make things that break the world, but you have to have this conversation also with these, and it's a very productive it's very productive tension as well, because it ensures also that you're doing it for the benefit of a greater good that we've sort of all agreed on, right?
Yeah, I think so. I think the only thing I would maybe hope in this world is, as the world seems to become increasingly more partisan, that we just take a little more time to listen to one another. I think sometimes people become very entrenched in their positions and just kind of close their ears to what the other side is saying. And I think, particularly in this kind of space, that each side needs to listen to one another. And if we stop doing that, then we won't land on the right result. So listening is important.
It's really weird, right? We're creating more tension, maybe because we don't want the tension. We're afraid of taking the conversation that is filled with tension. Then we're just creating even more chasms because we're not trying to reach each other. We're not trying to do the awkward handshake, right?
Yes. Yeah. Exactly right. And Brits don't like awkward handshakes.
But Phil, thank you so much for doing a not entirely awkward handshake with me today. But this has been a really brilliant conversation, and I've loved having you on it. And you are definitely an expert in these things. So I'll say that in the end, just to make you uncomfortable. Thank you, Phil.
I'm blushing, but no one will see it.
Thank you for listening. If you liked this episode, share it with a friend or a colleague.